Listen carefully, because what I'm about to tell you was never written in any official record, never archived in any church ledger, and never admitted by the men who enforced it. In the year 1835, in a valley so isolated it might as well have been carved out of the earth by a forgotten god, something happened that terrified even the people who lived by superstition. They whispered of a father who invoked an ancient rite, older than Christianity, older than the kingdom that claimed the land, older even than the language his people spoke. A rite meant to bind his bloodline to a force he believed would elevate him, but which ultimately consumed everything he loved. And the first sign of that corruption was a newborn foal that entered the world bearing something impossible, something unmistakably human in its features, a warning carved into flesh. You were never meant to hear this, because this story is not about a girl, a horse, or a monstrous birth. It is about control, the kind that hides behind rituals, behind authority, behind fathers who pretend to protect but only seek power. This is the kind of tale rural Europe told in hushed tones, not as entertainment, but as caution, that when a man lets ambition rot his soul, the darkness he courts will reshape his future in ways he cannot escape. The villagers who lived closest to the old manor said the father had changed long before the incident. He no longer prayed in church. He prayed in the old stone chamber beneath his barn, where the foundation had been laid by hands belonging to a pre-Christian cult. They said he muttered to things that moved behind the walls. They said he sought the union of the beast, a ritual meant to merge bloodlines, not physically, but symbolically, blending the strength of the animal with the lineage of man, creating a dynasty both feared and obeyed. When the foal was born with the face of the man's daughter, her unmistakable eyes, her quiet sadness carved into a newborn creature, no one believed it was an accident. No one believed it was nature. They believed it was the ritual manifesting itself, the cost of his ambition taking form. And the father, he didn't scream. He didn't tremble. He only smiled, as if the monstrous newborn confirmed everything he had sacrificed. This is where your descent begins. A story about the price of hidden power, and the kind of darkness men willingly walk into when they think no one is watching. Before you judge the villagers for their fear, you need to understand the world they lived in, a world where the past never really died. In 1835, the churches rang their bells and preached of salvation, but beneath those polished sermons, the soil still remembered the older beliefs. The forest still held the shadows of gods no one dared name, and the valley itself, isolated by cliffs, wrapped in mist, was a place where forgotten traditions clung to the people like a sickness passed down through generations. The father at the center of this story was not born a monster. Men rarely are. He began like any other, predictable, ambitious, hungry for respect in a world that offered him very little. But power is a parasite. It enters through pride, burrows through insecurity, and feeds on the parts of a man he refuses to confront. And the father, faced with the slow collapse of his land, his legacy, and his reputation, turned not to faith, but to the fragments of an older doctrine buried beneath his estate. Hidden beneath the barn was a chamber his ancestors had sealed centuries earlier, a place carved into stone, lit by cracks in the earth through which cold, unnatural air flowed. In that chamber, he found symbols that didn't match any Christian alphabet, carved circles meant for invocation, and a slab at the center, worn from what looked like centuries of ritual kneeling. This was not a place of worship. It was a place of bargain, and like every man who believes fate owes him something, he walked straight into its jaws. He studied the carvings for months, at first out of curiosity, then obsession. The villagers reported seeing candlelight leaking through the barn's windows at impossible hours. They heard the low hum of chanting carried by the wind. They heard the livestock pacing their stalls in patterns that suggested an unseen presence passing through. By the time winter melted into spring, the father no longer spoke like himself. His voice carried a strange calm, a predatory confidence. His daughter said he rarely blinked, that when he did, his eyes didn't refocus on her, as if they were adjusting to something else she couldn't see. And then he began speaking of union, a merging of lineage with strength beyond the frailty of men. He claimed their family had been chosen centuries ago, that the old symbols were proof of a pact waiting to be completed. Symbolic union, ritualistic merging, a metaphor twisted into something he believed would elevate his bloodline beyond mortality. But obsession always demands a sacrifice, and when the grotesque foal was born, bearing echoes of the daughter's features, it wasn't a literal transformation, but a manifestation of everything he invoked. A psychological imprint birthed into flesh. A warning made visible. The villagers saw a monster. He saw a promise. And the valley, it began to whisper again. You need to understand something crucial before we go deeper. In stories like this, stories whispered through centuries, buried beneath shame and fear, the literal events are never the point. What matters is what the people of that valley believed, and how belief shapes reality more powerfully than any blade, any law, any empire. When a community convinces itself that a man has touched forbidden power, they begin to see the effects everywhere. Their fear becomes a lens, and lenses distort. After the birth of the foal with the girl's features, the valley changed overnight. People stopped leaving their homes after sunset. Doors were locked with iron crosses. Old women clutched their rosaries until their knuckles went white. Mothers whispered warnings to their children, warnings not about wolves or storms, but about the man on the hill who had awakened something the earth had tried to bury. But the father didn't hide. He walked through the village in broad daylight, his boots echoing on the cobblestones like a metronome counting down to something inevitable. And when people met his eyes, they felt something pull at them, a feeling both magnetic and nauseating, like staring into someone who knew secrets about you that you hadn't confessed even to yourself. There's a specific kind of dread that comes from recognizing that another man understands the darkest corners of your mind, that he has no fear left because he has surrendered himself to something he believes is greater than morality, greater than consequence. What terrified the most was not the ritual, not the chamber, not even the monstrous foal. It was his certainty. The father spoke to the villagers with a confidence that cut deeper than any threat. He claimed, the birth marked an omen, the return of a pact made generations before. He told them their ancestors had once bowed to something older than the church, and that this union was simply the fulfillment of an ancient promise, a reclamation of power their bloodlines had abandoned. He didn't shout. He didn't demand. He simply spoke, and people listened. Because when a man believes he has been chosen, truly, unshakably chosen, his conviction becomes a force. And in a fragile community, force becomes dominance. The priest tried to intervene. He confronted the father outside the manor gates, scripture in hand, voice trembling with holy authority. But witnesses claimed the father only smiled and whispered something that made the priest's face drain of all color. The priest left without another word, locked himself inside the rectory, and refused to perform mass for 3 days. Fear spread like rot, because if the priest, armed with God, feared that whisper, what did it mean for everyone else? The valley had seen storms, sickness, famine, but nothing prepared them for a man who believed he had the backing of an ancient power. And this was only the beginning of the descent. Before the valley understood the full weight of what had been awakened, something subtle, something far more dangerous than any monstrous birth, began to seep into the minds of the people. Fear is loud, but control enters quietly. It disguises itself as inevitability, as tradition, as destiny. And the father, now more a vessel than a man, understood this instinctively. He had read it in the carvings beneath the barn, those spiraling symbols that spoke not in words, but in patterns, patterns designed to influence the mind, to guide thought, to twist obedience into something that felt voluntary. The chamber did not grant him power, it showed him how to take it. And he wasted no time. He opened his manor gates to the villagers, inviting them as though nothing strange had happened, as though he was simply a grieving father seeking goodwill. But the moment people crossed the threshold, they felt it, a heaviness in the air, like the walls absorbed their breath. Paintings that once depicted pastoral scenes now seemed darker, the colors muted, the subject's eyes following visitors with unwavering intention. The daughter, pale and silent, moved like a shadow behind him, as if a presence belonged to the house rather than to himself. The father spoke of heritage, of forgotten obligations, of a lineage tied to forces the church had falsely declared pagan. He framed the birth of the twisted foal not as horror, but as proof, physical evidence that the old pact still lived. And the villagers, already shaken by the priest's silence, found themselves listening despite their terror. Because in every group, there are always a few who fear loss more than corruption, a few who would rather kneel before darkness than face the uncertainty of an indifferent world. Those few became his earliest followers. He did not ask for worship. He asked for awareness. He told them the church had diluted their bloodlines, weakened their spirits, caged their primal authority. He claimed the old ways, his ancestors' ways, were not savage but enlightened. That unity with the natural forces had once made their people unbreakable. That fear was a tool wielded by institutions to keep men obedient. The villagers had heard echoes of this rhetoric before. Whispers during famines, rumors during wars. But hearing it from a man who walked with the confidence of prophecy made it feel less like rebellion, and more like revelation. A dangerous shift had begun. Not in the valley, not in the manor, but in the minds of the men who listened. Because once a man believes he has been denied power, he will burn his world to reclaim it. And the Father, he was ready to hand them the match. There's a moment, subtle, almost invisible, when fear transforms into fascination. When the thing that terrifies a man begins to pull him instead of repelling him. And that's what the Father understood better than anyone. Terror is only the first door. Beyond it lies curiosity, and beyond curiosity lies devotion. The moment he sensed the villagers were no longer running from him, but orbiting him, he changed his entire strategy. He stopped speaking of omens, stopped explaining the grotesque birth, stopped defending himself. Instead, he began asking questions, dangerous, guiding questions that made men interrogate their own fears. Have you ever wondered why your ancestors surrendered their strength? Why the church demanded obedience but never delivered protection? Why your bloodline weakens with every generation? These questions were not accusations. They were psychological hooks. And the villagers, poor, exhausted, superstitious, desperate for meaning, could not resist them. Each question forced them to confront something deeply uncomfortable, that perhaps they were not victims of fate, but of manipulation, that the institutions they trusted had shaped them into something smaller than what they might have been. It wasn't the supernatural birth that seduced them. It was the idea that they had been cheated. Men who feel powerless are always the easiest to sway. He led them into the barn, not the chamber, not yet, and spoke of the old rituals as if they were nothing more than lost traditions. He explained how ancient leaders used symbols to focus strength, how bloodlines once carried purpose instead of shame. He spoke of unity with nature, with the beasts of the earth, not as savagery but as alignment. And when he talked, he looked into each man's eyes as though he could see the exact place where their pride had been broken. People hunger for someone who understands their wounds. One by one, the men of the valley began returning to the manor at night. Not openly, not proudly, like thieves stealing back parts of themselves. They wanted to know more, not about the foal, not about the daughter, but about the power he claimed their ancestors once possessed. The Father understood that knowledge alone didn't bind men, identity did. So he gave them a new one. He told them they were the inheritors of a forgotten legacy, that the valley wasn't cursed, it was sacred, that the birth of the twisted foal was not the beginning of terror, but the beginning of awakening. And slowly, belief began to outweigh doubt. The valley didn't fall to magic, it fell to psychology. And the Father, he was only just beginning to shape their minds. By the time the first followers began gathering outside the manor after sundown, something fundamental had shifted in the valley's consciousness. It wasn't visible from the outside. No riots, no chaos, no flaming torches, but internally, within the minds of the men who lived there, tectonic plates were grinding. Doubt was dissolving. Old loyalties were thinning. The Father didn't command them. He didn't need to. They came because something inside them whispered that he possessed answers to questions they had been too afraid to ask their entire lives. And that is the most dangerous form of influence, the kind a man thinks he discovered on his own. The Father greeted them not like a leader, but like a confidant. He spoke softly, slowly, with the steady tone of someone revealing truths he believed they were finally ready to handle. And the men, fathers, farmers, hunters, men who had never questioned their place in the world, felt something they hadn't felt in years, significance. He made them believe the valley was more than a forgotten patch of soil, that they were more than nameless villages. He started with the past, not the official history written by priests or kings. The older one, the one passed down in fragments, in superstitions, in rituals their grandmothers performed without understanding why. He spoke of a time when their ancestors believed themselves woven into the fabric of the land, when every storm, every birth, every death had meaning, when power wasn't granted by crowns or holy books but inherited through blood and proven through courage. And then he asked them a question no one had ever dared ask out loud. When did you forget what you were? Silence answered him. He went deeper. He explained how institutions had chipped away at their identity, how fear had been weaponized, how obedience had been repackaged as virtue, how their instincts had been demonized to keep them compliant. He spoke of how power structures required men to feel small, to believe their heritage was something to hide rather than honor. The men listened, breath held, eyes fixed, minds unraveling. Then the father shifted to the chamber beneath the barn, describing it not as a shrine but as an archive, a repository of their true lineage, a place their ancestors carved into stone to preserve what the world would later try to erase. He told them the symbols weren't a cult, they were codes, instructions, a map to reclaim what had been stolen. Every word chipped away at their skepticism. Every pause tightened the hook. He had placed them on a path, and now their feet moved without question. Because once a man believes he has forgotten who he truly is, he will follow anyone who claims they can help him remember. Before he allowed a single man to see the chamber beneath the barn, the father did something far more important. He tested their loyalty, not through force, not through punishment, but through silence. He began withholding answers. When a man asked what the symbols meant, he would smile, close his eyes, and say, "You're not ready to see the pattern yet." When another asked about the birth of the foal, he would tilt his head and respond, "Truth reveals itself only to those who can bear its weight." And when someone demanded to know why a human likeness had appeared in an animal, he simply walked away as if the question itself exposed weakness. This tactic, intentional omission, is one of the oldest psychological weapons ever wielded. When a man is denied knowledge, that denial becomes its own form of desire. The father understood perfectly that secrecy breeds hunger, that what is concealed becomes sacred, that if you make information scarce, even the most rational minds will begin to chase it like starving wolves. Within a week, the men weren't just curious. They were obsessed. They waited outside the manor in the dark, breath turning to mist in the night air, hoping to be chosen for whatever next step the father hinted at. Some brought offerings, food, tools, heirlooms. Others brought nothing but their desperation. And the father watched them, noting who held eye contact, who trembled, who leaned on bravado to hide fear. He wasn't studying their devotion. He was studying their weaknesses. Because the chamber did not welcome strength alone. It demanded vulnerability. When he finally invited the first group inside, he chose them carefully. The men who felt overlooked by the world, the ones who hid their shame beneath hard work, the ones who had tasted failure and swallowed it because there was no one to blame. These men were the easiest to shape, the easiest to elevate, and the easiest to break if they strayed. Candlelight flickered as they gathered in the barn. The air was cold enough to make their bones ache. The father lifted the wooden planks at the center of the floor, revealing the stone staircase spiraling downward. A draft rose from the dark below, carrying the scent of earth that had not been touched by daylight in generations. No one spoke. No one dared. They followed him down. The chamber was older than any building in the valley. Its walls curved inward as though designed to draw attention to the center. The symbols carved into the stone did not form words, they formed movements. Flowing lines. Spirals. Shapes that disturbed the eye if you stayed too long. Shapes that felt like they were watching you. The father stood in the center, hand resting on the ancient slab, and said, "This is where your ancestors came to reclaim themselves. This is where your weakness ends." The men felt something then, not magic, not supernatural force, but the overwhelming weight of belonging. And once a man feels he belongs to something greater than himself, he will surrender almost anything to keep that feeling alive. The men stood in that chamber, breath shallow, hearts thudding like primitive drums, and something inside them began to shift. Not because of the symbols, not because of the stone, and certainly not because of any supernatural force lurking beneath the earth, but because the father understood exactly what environment does to a man's mind. Confined space, low light, cold air, a sense of entering forbidden territory. These things strip away doubt faster than any sermon. They make you feel as if leaving the room unchanged would be an insult to the place itself. The father let the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable, then until it became unbearable, then a little longer. By the time he spoke, their minds were primed to absorb anything. "Your ancestors came here," he said, "not to worship, but to remember, to reclaim what the world outside tried to take from them." Men once walked into this chamber broken, and walked out as something more. He looked at them, one by one, as if searching their faces for cracks. Some avoided his gaze. Others met it, desperate to be seen. He continued, "Power does not come from strength. It comes from clarity. And clarity begins where comfort ends. That is why you are here, to confront the weakness passed to you by institutions that wanted you obedient, not awake." It wasn't the words that struck them. It was the way he said weakness. As if it was a stain they had carried since birth. As if he could see it on them. The father moved around the chamber slowly, tracing the carved spirals with his fingertips. The symbols seemed to pulse in the candlelight, shadows stretching and retracting like breathing lungs. He explained that the spirals represented cycles, life, death, rebirth, identity. Not physical transformation, but spiritual realignment. A merging of instinct and discipline. A reclamation of the primal focus men had lost over centuries of imposed submission. He told them the monstrous foal was not a curse, but a sign. A physical echo of the imbalance created when men forgot who they were. A reflection of the valley's fractured identity. To hear him speak, it sounded less like madness and more like revelation. Fear began to melt. Curiosity hardened into belief. And belief into allegiance. Then he asked them to kneel. Not as worship, but as acknowledgement. A symbolic shedding of the identities they'd been forced to wear. One by one, their knees touched the cold stone floor. In that moment, they didn't kneel to the Father. They knelt to the idea of becoming more than what life had allowed them to be. And the descent, quiet, invisible, irreversible, deepened. Once a man kneels to an idea, the next step is inevitability. The Father did not ask for oaths or pledges. He understood that words are weak, but experiences are strong. He led them deeper into the chamber, past the carvings, past the low arches, until they reached a section sealed for centuries, a space no one had entered since their ancestors had walked these paths. The air here was heavier, carrying the scent of ice, sweat, and time itself. It pressed against their lungs, and yet, strangely, they wanted it. They wanted the pressure. They craved the discomfort, because it made them feel alive, aware, awake. He paused at the center of this inner sanctum. The floor was etched with more symbols, complex spirals interlaced with geometric shapes that seemed to defy rational construction. He told them these were not merely markings. They were instructions, maps for mental discipline, tools for understanding the hidden currents of control in their lives, the invisible forces that guided decisions, manipulated perception, and shaped their destinies without their consent. He explained that men who could read these patterns, not as decoration, but as language, could reclaim control over themselves, over others, and over circumstances that had always seemed random. The men leaned closer, eyes wide, fingers brushing the carvings, tracing the spirals. Some shivered. Others trembled with a thrill they hadn't felt since youth, when the world was new and full of promise. And the Father's voice, low and commanding, told them the truth they were only beginning to comprehend, that the valley's suffering, the church's control, the subjugation of their ancestors, all of it, was designed to teach obedience, not freedom. That what they called superstition was a cage. That fear was a chain, and that knowledge was the key. And then he said something that made every man there freeze. To understand the system, you must first see it. To see it, you must leave everything you think you know behind. Are you ready to watch the truth of your world? Some men hesitated. Some even looked toward the stairs, as if escape was still an option. But the Father only smiled, patient, inexorable, as though their hesitation was expected, even necessary. The chamber seemed to pulse in the candlelight, shadows stretching and contracting, whispering promises they could not yet understand. He told them that the journey from ignorance to understanding was painful, terrifying, and irreversible. Once you glimpse the machinery that shapes your life, from rulers to priests, from merchants to neighbors, you can never forget it. Once you awaken, you are no longer merely a man. You are a witness. And as he spoke, the foal outside, the creature that had once terrified the valley, stood in the moonlight. Its eyes, impossibly human, reflected the candlelight from below. A reminder that those who tamper with hidden forces do not escape them. That corruption, ambition, and obsession leave marks. And that those marks, visible or not, will follow every man who dares to step into forbidden knowledge. By the 10th night, the chamber had become more than stone and shadows. It had become a mirror. a mirror reflecting the deepest truths the men had spent their lives avoiding. Each spiral carved into the floor, each symbol etched into the walls, acted as a key, not to magic, not to superstition, but to understanding the invisible currents of control that ruled their lives. The father explained that the world outside their valley was a labyrinth of agendas, manipulations, and invisible hierarchies, and only those who learned to read the patterns could navigate it without being consumed. Men who ignored the signs would remain slaves to circumstance, to fear, to authority that demanded compliance without question. He spoke of the church, of the monarchs, of the merchants, and of the very concept of law itself, not as benevolent institutions, but as mechanisms designed to maintain order through obedience. Every man present began to feel the weight of unseen chains they hadn't realized were draped over their shoulders. And then the father asked them to look at the foal, the monstrous child of flesh and lineage, the mirror of consequence. He explained that what people dismissed as horror, as unnatural, was really a reflection of corruption unchecked, of ambition misaligned with wisdom. That when a man tries to grasp power without understanding, the world pushes back. And sometimes it leaves a visible scar. Sometimes it leaves one that can never be erased. You see, the father whispered, the valley is not cursed. It is instructive. The foal is not a monster. It is the lesson you refuse to learn. And you, standing here tonight, will either take the lesson, or you will repeat it. And then he did something that would forever bind the men to him. He told them to speak a phrase aloud, a simple sequence of words, twice. Not as a chant, not as a prayer, but as a declaration. I see the pattern, I claim the power. He instructed them to speak it first quietly, then louder, until their voices filled the chamber. Each repetition struck deeper, embedding itself in their minds. The act was small, yet monumental. It was a psychological ritual that cemented identity. By saying it, they acknowledged not just what the world had hidden from them, but also the dangerous knowledge that had been offered, and accepted. This was the moment when curiosity became allegiance, observation became transformation, fear became fuel. When the words echoed against the stone, the father smiled, eyes glinting in the candlelight. He knew the men were no longer the same. They had passed a threshold from which there was no return. The foal outside shifted, watching with those hauntingly human eyes, as if recognizing its place in the lesson, a lesson of ambition, obsession, and the invisible forces that shape life itself. The valley itself seemed to lean closer, listening, absorbing, waiting for what would come next. And just like that, the descent had deepened. What was once whispered fear had become intimate understanding. And understanding, when coupled with desire, can be more terrifying than ignorance ever was. After that night, the men did not leave the chamber. Not completely. Part of their minds remained trapped in the spirals, in the patterns, in the echoes of the words they had spoken aloud. The father didn't need to command them. They had already committed themselves. They walked through the village in daylight, but the world outside now felt different, smaller, weaker, pliable. The structures that once intimidated them, the church, the courts, even the elders, now seemed fragile, like puppets dangling from invisible strings. And the terrifying truth sank in. The same world that had kept them obedient could be understood, manipulated, and eventually mastered, if one knew where to look. The father taught them the first principle: perception is power. He said that every word spoken in public, every law obeyed without question, every tradition followed without insight was a leash on the mind. Men who control the lens, he told them, control the world. He demonstrated subtle ways to observe the village's reactions to small provocations. A shift in a glance, a hesitation in speech, a silent nod, all of it carried meaning. He made them aware that knowledge of hidden hierarchies, of human instinct, and of manipulated belief is the first weapon a man can wield against his own subjugation. Then came the lesson of obedience, not their obedience, but the obedience of others. He explained that influence is not achieved through force alone, but by creating structures of expectation. By understanding what people fear, desire, or revere, a man could bend them without anyone noticing. And the foal, the creature that had once caused horror, became the emblem of consequence, the visible outcome when ambition and ignorance collide. Its distorted form reminded the men that power without understanding always carries a cost, often a grotesque one. He led them further, teaching them how to blend fear and fascination, how to see doubt while appearing benign, how to make the invisible visible to those whose eyes were closed. Every technique was wrapped in metaphor, anchored in history, and reinforced by the chamber itself. The walls, the carvings, the air, all were part of the lesson. The medium becomes the message, the environment becomes a teacher. By the end of this session, the men understood one immutable truth. Once a man glimpses the machinery of control and the price of ignorance, he can never return to his former self. Knowledge is a scare, a baden, a form of liberation all at once. And in the shadows of the barn, beneath the spirals carved into ancient stone, they realized that following the Father was no longer a choice. It was the only path if they wished to survive and master what the world had always tried to hide from them. The descent had begun to feel inevitable. The following weeks blurred into a rhythm of initiation and observation. The men were no longer villagers in the old sense. They were apprentices in a system older than law, older than doctrine, older than the valley itself. The Father didn't need to threaten them. The fear of missing the next lesson was far more potent than any punishment. Each night, he led them deeper into the chamber, revealing more symbols, more spirals, more patterns that demanded interpretation, attention, and imagination. Every step forced them to question everything they had been taught. What is sacred? What is forbidden? What is natural? What is corrupted? And slowly, they began seeing the world through the lens he provided, a world of hidden hierarchies, of subtle control, of influence operating beneath the surface of every interaction. He began teaching them to recognize the systems themselves. Not the laws written on paper, not the sermons preached in churches, not the decrees of the Lord in the neighboring town, but the invisible forces that dictated obedience, loyalty, and faith. The Father explained that all institutions, religious, political, familial, are built on compliance, that power always manipulates perception before it enforces action, and that men who fail to perceive the patterns are doomed to repeat the mistakes of history. He told them, "The world outside this valley will try to make you small. Do not let it. See the threads, follow them, and you will never be bound again." Then he introduced them to another lesson. Symbols are not passive. They are alive. They are carriers of meaning, carriers of authority, carriers of fear and respect. A spiral, a line, a simple curve carved in stone can bend a man's attention, shape his belief, and steer his actions without his conscious understanding. The chamber itself became their teacher. Every wall, every floorboard, every carved mark was part of a psychological curriculum designed to awaken perception. He told them the Foal was the same, its form, its very existence a symbol of imbalance and consequence, a living demonstration of what happens when knowledge is ignored and power misused. By now, the men were no longer afraid. They were exhilarated. Their minds had been unlocked, and the taste of forbidden understanding was intoxicating. The Father reminded them that curiosity without discipline is dangerous, that awareness without control invites chaos, and that power observed but not practiced is wasted. He made them repeat the symbolic phrase again, this time in whispers beneath the spirals. "I see the pattern, I claim the power." Twice, as before, to solidify the transformation, to anchor the mind, to make the commitment undeniable. And when they spoke it, the air seemed to vibrate, the shadows seemed to stretch, and even the Foal outside appeared to watch, its eyes reflecting something older than memory. The valley itself had shifted. Nothing would ever be the same. The descent had deepened, and the men knew, without being told, that once you glimpse the machinery that shapes reality, there is no returning to ignorance. The Father did not stop at perception. Awareness, he explained, is only the first threshold. True mastery requires understanding consequence. He told them the story of the Foal over and over, not as folklore, but as instruction. Each retelling highlighted a different layer: the ambition of the Father, the corruption of lineage, the cost of ignorance, the blindness of institutions, and, most importantly, the way fear could be weaponized, not just externally, but within one's own mind. The men realized that the monstrous birth was a mirror, an illustration of what happens when power is sought without wisdom, when curiosity is unchecked by discipline, when desire outruns strategy. He emphasized that all of history was littered with foals, monsters born from mismanaged knowledge. The leaders who fell to betrayal, the kings who lost their kingdoms, the priests who preached morality but acted in greed, all were living lessons. And he made them understand that, Unlike those who came before, they had a choice. The foal outside, a grotesque manifestation of imbalance, became the symbol. They could study, learn from, and avoid replicating in their own lives. Its form was unnatural, yes, but its lesson was undeniable. Patterns exist, actions have consequences, and ambition without insight is fatal. Then the father introduced them to the concept of strategic fear, the harnessing of what terrifies men and turning it into control. He explained that fear was not a weakness to suppress, but a tool to master. By observing the reactions of others, by understanding their blind spots, by creating small disruptions in expectation, one could bend even large groups of men to will without violence. It was a dark science, a psychological warfare older than armies. The chamber itself was the first training ground. The shadows, the carvings, the cold walls, all of it taught the mind to perceive subtleties, to anticipate reactions, to sense influence before it struck. By this point, the men were no longer students. They were apprentices in the craft of observation, manipulation, and hidden influence. Their eyes moved differently, their gestures changed, their silence carried weight. The father reminded them that the valley was only the beginning. Beyond these hills lay a world designed to keep men small, distracted, and obedient. And only those who had endured the chamber, absorbed its lessons, and integrated its teachings could survive out there. And as they looked at the foal in the moonlight, they understood the paradox. The grotesque and the sublime are often inseparable. The creature was horrifying, yes, but it was also a teacher. And those who learned from it, who embraced the terror it inspired, were the ones who would ascend. The descent had crossed a point of no return. The men were awake, and the valley would never be the same. By now, the chamber had become more than a place. It was a crucible, a machine for transformation. The men who entered it did not return the same, because the lessons inside were not abstract. They were visceral, imprinted directly onto perception, onto instinct. The father understood this better than anyone. Knowledge that bypasses logic and strikes the subconscious is far more enduring than anything learned in books or sermons. And so he pushed them further, deeper into the study of patterns, of influence, of obedience, of hidden authority. Every gesture, every reaction, every whispered word outside the chamber became a case study. Nothing was irrelevant. Everything carried a signal. He taught them to see the subtle architecture of control, how the elders dictated fear, how merchants manipulated desire, how priests weaponized morality, how families unconsciously replicated cycles of obedience. Each revelation was accompanied by an illustration from the valley, from the foal, from the chamber itself. He wanted them to understand one immutable truth. Mastery begins with seeing the structures you are trapped within. And once you see them, you can navigate, or manipulate, them. And then came the lesson of identity. The father reminded them that power is not simply about domination over others. It is about reclaiming sovereignty over oneself. Every man had internalized fear, shame, and compliance over decades, often without realizing it. The chamber stripped these away, symbolically, literally, and psychologically. Kneeling to the spirals, speaking the phrase aloud, observing the foal, every ritual was a recalibration. The father said, "He who cannot command himself is always commanded." The moment you accept your own authority, the chains of the world begin to loosen. By the end of this night, something extraordinary happened. The men began speaking differently, walking differently, thinking differently. Their senses were sharpened. Their instincts, once dulled by routine and submission, began to hum with awareness. They were no longer ordinary villagers. They were observers, analysts, strategists. They could read intention in a glance, weakness in posture, fear in hesitation. And the father let them feel the weight of this realization fully. Knowledge is both liberation and burden. You cannot unsee what you have seen, and once you understand the machinery of control, ignorance becomes intolerable. Finally, he left them alone in the chamber for hours. Silence filled the stone space, but it was heavy, alive, almost sentient. Each man felt the presence of everything he had learned pressing down, imprinting itself onto his mind. When the first whispers began, low murmurs as they shared observations, theories, fears, they realized that the descent was no longer about the father, the foal, or the chamber. It was about themselves. The awakening was internal, irreversible, and dangerous. The valley had become a proving ground for men who would never return to the ordinary. The father knew that awakening without action is a trap. Knowledge, once absorbed, demands application. He began introducing the men to what he called the tests of influence. Small experiments at first, a carefully phrased question in the village square, a gesture that shifted a neighbor's behavior, a subtle suggestion that caused a chain reaction without anyone noticing. These exercises were designed to sharpen observation, to transform insight into execution. The men learned that even tiny actions could ripple outward, reshaping perceptions and expectations. They were no longer passive observers, they were participants in the hidden currents that guided human behavior. Next, he taught them restraint, the most dangerous and powerful lesson of all. Power is tempting, and men will always seek to use it immediately. But impulsive action exposes weakness. The father instructed them to watch, to anticipate, to understand the larger game. They studied how influence circulates, how fear spreads faster than hope, how obedience can be orchestrated without a single command. The foal, once a symbol of horror, became a silent tutor. Its distorted human-like features reminded them that actions without foresight create monstrosities. Every misstep has consequences, and mastery demands patience. Then he introduced the idea of hidden agendas. Nothing in the valley was accidental. Every decision, every rule, every expectation carried layers of intent, often invisible. He explained how historical figures, kings, generals, priests, used obscured motives to shape societies. By recognizing these hidden currents, the men could see the true game behind every encounter. The valley, he said, was a microcosm. The foal was an illustration, a result of ambition entangled with ignorance. In life, consequences are rarely straightforward. Understanding the underlying pattern allows a man to navigate the chaos without being crushed by it. By now, the men were no longer just pupils, they were apprentices in a dark craft, aware of forces most never perceive. Their senses had sharpened, their minds could detect subtleties invisible to ordinary men. The father reminded them that this knowledge carries a price: isolation. Ordinary villagers cannot comprehend men who perceive the hidden architecture of control. Trust becomes complicated, relationships fragile, life forever altered. The chamber had given them power, yes, but also responsibility. And just before they left the chamber that night, he instructed them again to speak the symbolic phrase aloud, twice, solidifying their transformation. I see the pattern, I claim the power. Their voices echoed against the stone, bouncing back like a vow to themselves, a warning to the world, and a binding thread that would link them forever to the descent they had begun. The men left, but the chamber remained, silent, patient, waiting for the next mind ready to awaken. The valley itself had shifted, its air heavier, its shadows longer, its stories darker. Nothing would ever be the same. The valley began to change, imperceptibly at first, then unmistakably. The men returned to their daily routines, but nothing felt ordinary. Every conversation, every interaction, carried layers of subtext they could now perceive. They noticed hesitation in voices that once seemed confident, ambition masked as humility, subtle manipulation hiding behind courtesy. The father had trained them not only to observe the world, but to see the hidden strings behind every movement, every gesture. What once seemed random was now part of a larger, orchestrated pattern. The foal, still grazing in the moonlight outside the barn, became a living emblem. Its presence was a reminder that imbalance manifests in physical, tangible ways. Men who sought power without understanding created monsters, both in the world and within themselves. The villagers, ignorant of what had transpired in the chamber, whispered rumors of unnatural happenings. The childlike human features, the father's obsession, the men moving differently, but none could piece together the truth. And that was the lesson. Most will see only what they are conditioned to see, and even when confronted with evidence, the mind can be blind. The father began instructing them in strategy beyond the valley. A man who understands the mechanisms of control can operate in any environment, he said. But he must also understand patience, observation, and timing. Knowledge without execution is wasted. Power without perception is dangerous. You are not here to dominate blindly. You are here to master the currents unseen by others. He spoke of influence as both shield and weapon, a force to shape perception without confrontation, to bend outcomes before they solidify into consequences. He explained how entire societies operate on invisible hierarchies, how fear, desire, and obligation are leveraged to maintain order, and how men trained to see these structures could navigate life like chess masters, predicting moves, anticipating responses, and shaping events from the shadows. The valley had been their classroom, the foal, their cautionary tale, the chamber, their crucible. And now, the Father was teaching them to integrate these lessons into the world beyond the stones, the shadows, and the spirals. By the end of these sessions, the men had become something entirely new. They were no longer simply villagers, fathers, and farmers. They were observers of reality, attuned to patterns invisible to most, capable of reading intention, predicting consequence, and navigating the machinery of power with precision. And they understood the unspoken truth. Once you see the forces that shape men, once you grasp the hidden architecture of control, there is no turning back. Ignorance is no longer possible. The descent had progressed further, and the valley had become a microcosm of revelation, a laboratory of perception, and a warning. The world rewards the perceptive, punishes the naive, and destroys those who fail to recognize the cost of ambition and tempered by wisdom. As the weeks stretched on, the Father began integrating the final layer of his instruction, the control of narrative. He taught them that stories are more than entertainment. They are the instruments of perception, shaping thought, loyalty, and behavior without the audience realizing it. History, he said, is written by those who understand the power of narrative. And those who control narrative control not just the past, but the present and the future. He reminded them of the foal. The legend of its birth would spread faster than any instruction manual, influencing minds far beyond the valley. Horror and fascination, he explained, are potent tools when leveraged intentionally. The men practiced shaping conversations, framing events, and guiding villagers' attention without them knowing. A question phrased in just the right way could plant doubt. A carefully recounted story could inspire obedience or fear. Observation was only the first step. Subtle influence was the second, and shaping belief, what people thought possible or impossible, was the final step. The Father emphasized that a master does not force belief. He guides perception until belief feels like choice. The valley was their laboratory, and the foal's grotesque form served as a constant illustration of what happens when influence is ignored or misapplied. He also drilled them on patience. Influence, he explained, is never immediate. The world outside would resist, test, and tempt them. Only those who endure, who act strategically, who control impulse, can achieve lasting power. He demonstrated how a single word, delivered at the precise moment, could unravel carefully constructed plans, or conversely, bind others to unseen commitments. Every lesson drew on the natural fear and awe that had permeated the valley since the foal's birth. The men internalized that emotions, fear, desire, hope, are the levers of control, and the perceptive man who understands them can move mountains without ever lifting a hand. And then came the final test of allegiance. The Father instructed the men to return to the barn at midnight, alone, and stare directly at the foal until their minds could process the lesson it represented. Fear would rise, doubt would attack, and instinct would scream to flee, but they were to endure. Only by facing the visible manifestation of chaos, consequence, and corrupted ambition could they internalize the gravity of the path they had chosen. Those who faltered would reveal weakness. Those who remained would prove themselves ready for the broader world beyond the valley. By the end of the night, the foal had become a mirror. It reflected not just horror, but insight. It reflected the cost of ignorance, the weight of ambition, the consequences of obsession, and the power of understanding hidden systems. Those who confronted it walked away changed, irrevocably. And in that moment, the valley, the chamber, and the Father's teachings coalesced into a singular truth. Mastery over the unseen forces of life requires courage, patience, perception, and the willingness to face the monstrous consequences of knowledge itself. The descent had reached a threshold that few could ever return from. The next stage was subtle but profound. They began seeing themselves not as villagers, but as actors within a larger system, a system designed to limit, to distract, to subjugate. The Father made them understand that the world outside the valley operates on rules that few perceive, rules that enforce compliance without explanation. Institutions, he said, do not wield authority by chance. They construct perception, manipulate fear, and control the narrative. Every man who learned to read these patterns could claim freedom not by rebellion, but by awareness. And freedom, once tasted, can never be ignored. He began guiding them through exercises of applied influence. Not coercion, not violence, but subtle, invisible shifts that bend reality. A suggestion whispered at the right moment could redirect suspicion. A carefully framed story could inspire compliance. Even silence, used deliberately, could elicit confessions, obedience, or alignment with unseen agendas. The Foal, ever present, was now a living symbol, a warning and a teacher. It demonstrated how deviation from patterns produces monstrous consequences, how unchecked ambition without strategy births chaos. To understand it was to understand the stakes. The father explained that the human mind is the battlefield. Every man carries invisible levers of fear, hope, shame, and desire, and those who perceive these forces can guide not just behavior, but belief itself. The chamber had conditioned them to see, to endure, to interpret, and now it trained them to act. Small victories in observation became exercises in influence, and influence became the precursor to power. He reminded them that knowledge untested is meaningless. Only by stepping into the world and applying what they had internalized could they survive and thrive. And then he confronted them with the ultimate truth. The world will resist your awakening. Those who are awake see patterns, but those still asleep cling to illusion. Men who wield power without awareness become tyrants. Men who see without control become slaves. The Father's teachings were a crucible designed to forge men who could navigate, manipulate, and master the unseen currents. The chamber, the foal, the rituals, they were all scaffolding for a mind strong enough to survive truths most cannot bear. Finally, he left them in silence with the foal once more, the creature's human-like eyes reflecting candlelight like twin warnings. He reminded them that mastery is not a destination. It is vigilance, patience, and enduring comprehension of the patterns that govern life. Each man understood, in that moment, that the descent they had undertaken was not merely into a chamber or a story. It was into themselves, into the dangerous knowledge that changes perception, identity, and destiny forever. Once you see the machinery of control, once you grasp the consequences of ambition and ignorance, there is no turning back. The descent had reached its full depth. The valley had produced something new, something dangerous, something awake. By this stage, the valley itself seemed transformed. The fog rolling over the hills carried a weight now, a subtle whisper of anticipation and unease. The men walked among their neighbors, yet they were no longer the same. Ordinary tasks, chopping wood, tending animals, delivering goods, had acquired a new dimension. Every gesture, every glance, every word was an opportunity to observe, to analyze, to understand the hidden structures governing behavior. The Father had taught them to perceive the invisible threads of influence that tied men to expectation, obedience, and fear. And once you see those threads, you begin to sense the machinery behind everything: the laws, the sermons, the traditions, the unspoken hierarchies of power. The Foal, grotesque and haunting, had become a central figure in this education. It was no longer simply a creature to fear or pity. It was a living lesson in consequence. Every movement, every twitch, every flicker of its human-like features reminded the men of what happens when ambition is pursued without comprehension, when curiosity is divorced from discipline, when instinct is ignored. They realized that horror can be instructive, that fascination can teach what words cannot. And in this reflection, they learned their first true principle: power without understanding is meaningless. Strength without insight is destructive, and knowledge without courage is wasted. The Father emphasized a dangerous truth. The world is built to blind men, to confine their potential, to reduce them to functionaries within systems they barely comprehend. Institutions thrive by shaping perception, by controlling fear, by directing attention. And those who refuse to see, those who cling to comfort, tradition, and obedience, become instruments of their own suppression. He showed them how to identify manipulation, how to read hidden intent, how to anticipate reactions, and how to bend outcomes subtly. Knowledge of these currents does not make one invincible, but it makes one unstoppable to the untrained. Then came the lesson of legacy. The Foal, he said, is not a singular aberration. It is the consequence of ignoring lineage, of neglecting the past, of failing to respect the forces that shape life. The men understood that their mastery carried responsibility. Awareness was a weapon, but also a burden. Those who walk with knowledge must navigate life with precision, patience, and strategy. Every misstep could echo, manifesting consequences visible or invisible, immediate or delayed. The chamber had prepared them, the spirals had conditioned them, and the Foal had warned them, but the world outside would be the true test. Finally, the Father reminded them that the descent is continuous. Awareness is never complete, patterns evolve, agendas shift, and perception must constantly adapt. Mastery is vigilance, discipline, and courage in the face of knowledge most cannot bear. And as the men gazed once more at the Foal in the dim moonlight, they understood that their transformation was irreversible. The descent was no longer a journey, it was a state of being. They had crossed a threshold, and the valley itself had become a crucible of awakening, a laboratory of power, and a warning to any who might one day dare to follow in their path. The Father's instruction moved from observation to strategy. He taught that true mastery requires understanding timing. Influence, he said, is ineffective when applied too soon, too aggressively, or without context. A subtle word, a small gesture, or a deliberate silence at the wrong moment can unravel months of preparation. He demonstrated this with the villagers themselves, guiding the apprentices to plant suggestions in conversations that seemed innocent, yet subtly shifted opinion, stirred curiosity, and created dependency. They were learning to manipulate the invisible, to shape perception before anyone realized a shift had occurred. He explained that fear and fascination are the most potent levers of control, but must be calibrated. Too much fear, and men resist. Too little, and they remain indifferent. The Foal remained a living example, grotesque enough to provoke awe, yet familiar enough to anchor observation and reflection. The apprentices learned to measure reactions, micro-expressions, posture, hesitation, as signals of underlying motives. Each encounter became a laboratory, every interaction a demonstration of cause and effect. Knowledge was no longer abstract. It was applied, tactical, dangerous. Then he introduced lessons of alignment and patience. A man who understands patterns but acts impulsively wastes opportunity. Power is cumulative, he explained. Subtle influence compounds over time. He instructed them to watch interactions not only for immediate outcomes, but for the ripple effects across hours, days, and weeks. The Foal, always present, was a reminder that consequences of misaligned ambition can appear grotesque, unexpected, and irreversible. A single mistake in judgment, left unchecked, can create a chain reaction that destabilizes everything. He began teaching them perception as armor. Ordinary men are blind to manipulation because they never question reality. These apprentices now saw the architecture of control, the hidden hierarchies in every institution, the patterns of compliance and defiance, the levers that shape behavior invisibly. They learned to anticipate, to interpret, and to act with precision. Observation became instinct, and instinct became strategy. Finally, he emphasized that mastery is inseparable from responsibility. Knowledge of the machinery that governs life is intoxicating, but dangerous. Misapplied, it corrupts. Misunderstood, it destroys. He left them alone in the chamber with the Foal, shadows dancing across the spirals, as the apprentices absorbed the gravity of their transformation. They understood now that the descent was more than a journey of fear. It was a passage into awareness, power, and irrevocable change. And the valley, silent and watchful, seemed to pulse with the weight of the knowledge it now contained. The Father began to reveal the final layer of his instruction, the invisible web of human desire and deception. He explained that every man, every institution, every hierarchy operates through subtle exchange, fear for obedience, hope for compliance, admiration for influence. Most men never perceive these exchanges. They act within them blindly, like ants following trails laid by unseen masters. But those who observe, measure, and manipulate these currents gain a profound advantage. The valley became a microcosm of this truth, a laboratory in which the apprentices could practice, fail safely, and recalibrate. He introduced the notion that knowledge is a living force. It can awaken or destroy depending on the wielder. The Foal, grotesque and unnatural, embodied the consequences of misuse. It was not a creature to be dismissed. It was a warning that ambition without understanding manifests in the most horrific forms. The apprentices learned that their own transformation was mirrored in the Foal. Awareness, once achieved, produces both power and burden. To wield influence, One must first confront the monstrous reflection of one's own intemperate instincts. Then he taught subtlety and manipulation. Not coercion, not force, but suggestion, framing, and timing. Every gesture, every glance, every word carries weight. A question phrased incorrectly provokes resistance. A phrase delivered at the right moment sparks compliance. The apprentices practiced in controlled environments, the village, the barn, even the shadows of the chamber itself. Each success reinforced confidence. Each failure revealed a hidden variable, an unseen force to anticipate next time. They were learning to shape reality before others even recognized it existed. He emphasized observation as the foundation of power, seeing the mechanics of human behavior, understanding the unseen hierarchies, detecting microshifts in posture, tone, and expression. These were the tools that separate the awakened from the obedient. And then he revealed the ultimate truth. The world outside the valley is a chessboard. Most men are pieces. Some are pawns unaware of the rules. A few, who understand, can orchestrate the entire game. Mastery comes not from brute force, but from knowledge, patience, and calculated action. Finally, he instructed them to face the foal alone, as a final reflection. Its presence forced them to confront fear, fascination, and consequence simultaneously. To look directly at the grotesque truth of mismanaged power was to understand the stakes of mastery. Those who turned away had not yet internalized the lesson. Those who stayed were irrevocably changed. The descent into forbidden knowledge, once begun, cannot be reversed. And in that chamber, beneath spirals carved by ancestors long dead, the apprentices realized that they had crossed a line from which ordinary life would never recover. The father spoke then of lineage, not merely bloodline, but the inheritance of knowledge, power, and consequence. He reminded the apprentices that the valley itself had produced cycles of obedience and rebellion, of ambition and failure, repeated over centuries. The foal, grotesque and uncanny, was a living testament to what happens when knowledge is misused or ignored. Its human-like features were not simply a horror. They were a mirror reflecting the collective failures of those who came before, the mistakes of ambition untethered from wisdom. Every apprentice understood, deep in their bones, that the lessons were not abstract. History has weight, and it leaves marks, both visible and invisible. He taught them that society thrives on ignorance, that institutions survive because the majority are blind to the machinery of control. The world, he said, feeds on compliance. It thrives on distraction, illusion, and unquestioned hierarchy. The few who see the patterns must learn to navigate quietly, strategically, or they are destroyed. The apprentices felt the weight of this truth. They were no longer simply men in a village. They were observers and potential manipulators of systems most people accept blindly. Their awareness was a dangerous currency. Then came the lesson of duality. Fear and fascination, horror and curiosity, obedience and rebellion. They are inseparable, and one cannot master the world without understanding both sides of the coin. The foal represented this perfectly, a being both repulsive and compelling, grotesque yet instructive. To turn away from the lesson is to choose ignorance. To face it is to invite transformation. The chamber, with its spirals and symbols, became a tool to embed this duality in their perception. It trained them to observe without immediate judgment, to recognize consequences without panic, to integrate discomfort into understanding. The father instructed them to test themselves in the outside world. Small experiments, plant a doubt, observe the ripple, measure. Compliance, note hesitation. These were exercises in real-world influence, using the lessons of observation, subtlety, and timing. Each apprentice became a silent strategist, a man who could read intention, anticipate reaction, and act with precision. He reminded them that knowledge untested is dangerous, and influence unpracticed is wasted. Finally, the father left them with a chilling truth. The world outside the valley will try to punish insight, resist perception, and blind the aware. Only those who maintain vigilance, patience, and strategic action can survive. The foal, waiting in the shadows of the barn, was the ever-present reminder that power and consequence are inseparable. The apprentices, transformed, understood that the descent was no longer a journey. It was an awakening. Once knowledge this dangerous touches a mind, there is no retaining. The valley, once quiet and contained, had begun to hum with a different energy. The apprentices moved among villages, yet they were no longer of the same world. Ordinary interactions had become experiments, observations, and lessons. A glance, a gesture, a word. They measured them all, cataloging human behavior with precision. The Father had taught them that most men act within invisible constraints, blind to the currents that guide every decision. By seeing the patterns, they could navigate, manipulate, and anticipate outcomes. Ignorance had once been comfortable. Now it was intolerable. He began teaching them about the fragility of institutions. Churches, courts, merchants, they all rely on compliance, on the unawareness of those who follow them blindly. A single awakened individual, if careful and patient, can shift the balance in subtle ways. The Foal, grotesque and silent, was a constant lesson. Misaligned ambition manifests consequences that are both horrifying and instructive. The apprentices were learning that observation is power, but action, guided by insight, is mastery. Fear is a tool, not a weakness. Curiosity is a weapon, not indulgence. The Father introduced exercises in psychological alignment. They learned to phrase questions to provoke reflection, to offer choices that guide action, to use silence as a lever of influence. Each experiment was deliberate, each failure instructive. Subtle influence became instinctual, embedded into their perception of the world, and with every interaction, they recognized that they were no longer simply participants in life. They were architects of perception, capable of shaping outcomes without the awareness of those around them. Then he revealed the truth of consequence. Knowledge without foresight is dangerous, and influence without strategy is catastrophic. The Foal outside, an unnatural hybrid of human and animal, was a warning. Ambition untethered from understanding birth's monstrosity. The apprentices internalized this as a principle. Every action carries weight, every choice has repercussions, and mastery requires constant awareness. They began to see patterns not only in individuals, but across systems, understanding how institutions, families, and societies repeat cycles of control, obedience, and rebellion. Finally, he challenged them to face discomfort directly. Alone in the chamber, they stared at the Foal until fear, fascination, and comprehension merged. Each man experienced the monstrous reflection of what happens when insight is neglected and ambition misapplied. In that confrontation, the final lesson became clear. The descent into knowledge is irreversible, and those who survive it emerge changed. They were no longer merely men. They were witnesses, strategists, and custodians of forbidden insight. The valley had forged them into something dangerous, awake, and aware. The Father began revealing the mechanics of manipulation on a larger scale. He explained that influence is never random. It flows through channels carefully constructed over time. Society, he said, is a network of invisible levers: status, fear, loyalty, desire, all calibrated to maintain order. Most men move blindly within these channels, unaware of their limitations, their biases, and the subtle pressures shaping their thoughts and actions. The apprentices, sharpened by the chamber and the Foal's lesson, could now detect these currents, anticipate movement, and intervene strategically. Observation had become mastery of cause and effect. He introduced the concept of layered control. Every institution, every family, every community operates on multiple levels simultaneously. Visible rules, hidden expectations, unspoken loyalties, and deeply embedded fears. A man who understands only one layer remains constrained. A man who perceives all can navigate freely, bend outcomes, and protect himself from manipulation. The Foal remained central to this lesson. Grotesque and unnerving, it demonstrated the collapse that occurs when ambition, ignorance, and desire intersect without comprehension. Its existence was a proof of principle, a warning written in flesh. The apprentices began applying the lessons outside the chamber. In the village, they observed how a simple phrase could spark obedience, how suggestion could guide belief, and how silence could compel confession. They learned to measure influence, calibrate timing, and integrate subtlety. Even when interacting with the unaware, they noticed patterns in behavior, instinctively predicting reactions before they occurred. The valley itself became their testing ground, a live demonstration of the principles the Father had instilled. Then he spoke of history as a living teacher. Wars, dynasties, revolutions, betrayals, they all follow patterns. Ambition without insight always produces disaster. Obedience without awareness always produces tyranny. Insight without action produces regret. The Foal, a product of misaligned ambition, served as a visual lesson that history repeats itself in microcosm. Understanding consequence, he stressed, is as critical as understanding perception. Power without comprehension is chaos. Knowledge without discipline is dangerous. Finally, the father reminded them of the most uncomfortable truth. Most men will never perceive the machinery of life. They will follow, obey, and resist change without understanding why. Those who awaken, who see the patterns, who internalize consequence, carry a burden heavier than most can imagine. And yet, he said, this burden is also a gift. Awareness is power. Insight is liberty. Mastery is both terrifying and exhilarating. The apprentices had crossed the threshold. The descent was no longer a journey. It had become their nature, irreversible and profound. By now, the apprentices began to understand the world as a series of veils, each one designed to obscure truth, manipulate belief, and contain potential. The father revealed that every institution, from the smallest village council to the grandest monarchy, operates on these veils. Fear, tradition, and obligation act as filters, directing attention away from the machinery of control. Ordinary men remain trapped, obedient to invisible patterns they cannot perceive. But the apprentices had been trained to pierce those veils, to see the mechanisms beneath the ritual, and to anticipate the outcomes of actions before they manifest. The foal, always present in the background, was no longer merely a lesson. It was a mirror reflecting the dangers of misaligned ambition. Its human-like face and an animal body demonstrated the grotesque consequences of pursuing desire without understanding. Each apprentice internalized this as a fundamental principle. Mastery requires comprehension, foresight, and respect for consequences. To ignore these truths is to invite catastrophe. The valley, the chamber, and the spirals carved into the stones had forged a mental discipline capable of recognizing imbalance in any form, subtle or overt. Then came the exercises in influence as strategy. The father guided them in experimenting with perception, shaping belief, and testing reactions in ways that seemed innocuous to the unaware. A question, a gesture, or even silence could recalibrate the behavior of others. Timing, subtlety, and precision became as important as the lesson itself. The apprentices discovered that they could provoke change without confrontation, guide decisions without force, and manipulate outcomes while remaining invisible. The full silent observation reinforced the lesson. Consequences always manifest, often unpredictably, and understanding them before they occur is the mark of mastery. The father reminded them that history is written not by the many, but by those who perceive patterns others miss. Kings, generals, priests, and merchants all succeed or fail based on their ability to see what lies beneath the surface. The foal's grotesque form, a warning in physical reality, mirrored the unseen disasters history hides. Ambition untempered by wisdom, curiosity untethered from discipline, and desire divorced from consequence. Awareness of patterns allows a man to navigate chaos without being consumed. Finally, he left them with a challenge. Observation alone is not enough. The apprentices must now integrate lessons, practice influence, anticipate consequence, and operate within the world that cannot see them. The valley had been a crucible. The foal had been the warning. The chamber had been the training ground. Now, they were sent into the world awake, perceptive, and dangerous. The descent had transformed them irreversibly, and the knowledge they carried was a burden and a weapon, one that could elevate, or destroy, any man who dared to wield it. The father spoke of perception as the ultimate weapon. Most men live in a curated reality, a version of life carefully filtered by those who understand the hidden levers of control. The apprentices, now trained in observation and influence, could perceive the invisible threads that bind behavior, expectation, and belief. Every word, gesture, and symbol carried weight. Ordinary men are blind to these threads. The uninitiated follow them unconsciously, unaware they are being guided. The awakened man, however, sees the currents, anticipates the flow, and shapes outcomes with precision. He demonstrated how language itself is a battlefield. Words are not neutral. They carry suggestion, expectation, and intention. A phrase carefully chosen can redirect thought, reshape desire, or ignite fear. The apprentices practiced subtle manipulations, observing reactions to questions, statements, and even silence. They learned to calibrate influence, understanding that timing, context, and perception are as crucial as content. The foal, grotesque and unblinking, became a constant reminder that every miscalculation carries consequences, some immediate, some delayed, and all irreversible. The father introduced them to the architecture of control embedded in institutions. From courts to churches, markets to schools, every structure operates through predictable patterns. Obedience, loyalty, and fear are carefully cultivated. The majority of men navigate these systems blindly, obeying without comprehension. The apprentices, however, were learning to see the rules beneath the rules, to detect the invisible hierarchies that govern action, and to exploit gaps without alerting those in control. Awareness, he explained, is not enough. Mastery requires strategic action. Then came the lesson of duality. Power carries both reward and risk. To see, understand, and act in the world of hidden structures is intoxicating, but perilous. The foal symbolized the monstrous consequence of failure, the collapse that occurs when ambition is misaligned with insight. Every apprentice internalized this lesson. Knowledge is liberation, but it also bears a burden heavier than ordinary men can imagine. Every decision now carries weight, every action must be measured, and every influence must be intentional. Finally, the father left them to sit in silence, alone with their thoughts and the foal's gaze. Fear, fascination, and comprehension collided. The apprentices felt the full gravity of their transformation. The valley, the chamber, and the spirals had done their work. The descent was complete. Perception, influence, and consequence were now inseparable from their identities. They had crossed a line. There was no turning back. The world outside awaited, but they were no longer ordinary men. They were awake, aware, and dangerous. The father then revealed the final truth about control, the unseen hierarchy of human attention. Where men focus, he said, there flows power. Where attention is manipulated, belief is shaped. Where perception is guided, reality itself bends. He explained that most men are enslaved by distraction, conditioned to fixate on irrelevant details, consumed by noise. The apprentices had been trained to pierce this veil, to observe the currents beneath appearances, and to act where others would not even notice. Awareness alone, he warned, is not mastery. It is the ability to see,